I know about your affair, tell her I want a divorce now. That's what I wrote, my fingers shaking with rage, while my cell phone glowed in front of me like a small witness to the implosion of my life. I sent that message to the number of the man who danced with my wife at the company party, a stranger who dared to touch her as if I were invisible, as if she didn't have a ring on her finger that connected her to me. I knew. They thought I was blind, deaf or stupid, but I knew. The look she gave him all night, the way she laughed at his jokes, these weren't the laughs she usually reserved for me, but something more. Something that burned me alive inside. The truth, that bitter and unbearable truth, did not come from a great revelation. It was slowly building, like a storm brewing on the horizon, every detail, every word spoken, every silence filled with tension. At the party, I watched how he approached her, how she didn't back away. He whispered something, and she smiled in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years. It was there, at that moment, that the world I knew began to fall apart. I returned home that night with my mind spiraling, revisiting every moment that could have been a clue and ignoring my own instinct to miss the obvious. Her cell phone vibrated late at night, and his name appeared on the screen. A name that, until a few hours ago, was irrelevant to me. I picked up the device, opened the message, and there it was, something as simple as, "I miss you already," was like a knife going through my chest. There was no more room for denial. The next morning, as she slept next to me, I got out of bed and walked through the house, feeling the betrayal like a suffocating shadow around me. I looked at our living room, at the wedding photos on the bookshelf, and wondered how we got there. How can someone share so many years, so many plans and promises, and then trample on everything as if it were worthless? I needed answers. And if she wasn't able to give them, he would be. That's why I sent the message. The cell phone vibrated minutes later. The answer was concise and almost challenging, "Then talk to her yourself. I'm tired of this game." The blood boiled in my veins. Game. To him, was my life just that? A game? I went to the bedroom, pulled the curtains tightly and looked at her face as she woke up to the light invading the room. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice icy, controlled only by the willpower I had left. She blinked a few times, confused, or at least pretending to be. "Who are you talking about?" he replied, but there was something in her eyes, a flash of recognition, that confirmed everything. I didn't have to scream. I didn't need to launch accusations. I just took her cell phone and threw it on the bed. She looked at the screen, saw his name in the messages, and her expression changed. He tried to say something, but there were no words to erase what had been done. She knew she was trapped. "It's not what you think," he began, but the silence that followed was so thick that it swallowed up any attempt to justify the unjustifiable. I didn't want to hear it. Not at that time. I left before the walls fell in on me. At work, my head was a whirlwind. The familiar faces around me meant nothing, everything seemed distant, surreal. Until a colleague approached, someone I used to talk to from time to time, and mentioned something that, at first glance, seemed like an absurd coincidence. He insinuated that he had seen my wife with a man, the same man, in a restaurant a few days earlier, in broad daylight. I thought it was strange, but I didn't mean anything, he said, a little uncomfortable, realizing too late that his words only fueled the fire that consumed me. I went home that night not knowing exactly what I was going to do. She was waiting for me in the living room, her gaze filled with something that could be guilt or fear. "We need to talk," he said, and I sat down, still in disbelief that this was the woman with whom I had shared so much. She tried to justify it, tried to paint what she did as a moment of weakness, something that didn't mean anything. But it meant everything. Her every word was a reminder of how love can turn into something toxic, poisonous. The following days were a blur of confrontations and revelations. But the most brutal part came from where I least expected it. An anonymous complaint reached my company's human resources department, accusing that man, the lover, of misconduct and involvement in a corruption scheme that put the entire organization at risk. Suddenly, the extramarital affair was no longer just a personal matter, but something that threatened to destroy my career, my reputation, and everything I had worked for. Investigations began, and with them, the scandalous details came to light. The betrayal, once confined to the walls of my home, was now a secret that crumbled in front of everyone. I watched, helplessly, as my colleagues' gazes turned to me, while whispers echoed through the hallways. The humiliation was unbearable. But I wasn't the one who would face the worst consequences. I knew them well enough to know that the lover and my wife had become deeply involved, and not just emotionally. They had become complicit in something bigger, and it was now impossible to hide. It was then that I realized that, despite all the pain, I had something they didn't, the truth. She was there, in every text message, in every detail I had carefully gathered. The truth was my weapon, and I intended to use it. But how? And how far was I willing to go to expose not just the betrayal, but the corruption that came with it? As my mind formulated a plan, I realized this was just the beginning. Their destruction was coming, but my own reconstruction also depended on it. What happened next was out of my control, or at least that's what it seemed like. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful lesson, showing how betrayal is capable of destroying lives, relationships, and even futures. Get ready to dive into a shocking narrative, full of emotion, twists, and real consequences. We wish you a good story, but be careful, the impact will be unforgettable. Thomas and Sophie's home seemed like a perfect retreat to anyone watching from the outside. Situated in a quiet neighborhood, with well-kept gardens and surrounded by ancient trees, it was the kind of home that conveyed a feeling of security and stability. They had been married for 12 years, and to their friends and neighbors, they were the portrait of a successful and loving couple. Thomas worked as a finance manager in a medium-sized company, while Sophie dedicated her creativity to interior design, running a small but thriving local business. Together, they seemed like a balanced match, his pragmatism complementing her artistic vision. Thomas was a methodical, organized man with a slight touch of perfectionism. He grew up in a humble family, where he learned from an early age the value of effort and resilience. He had a calm, almost cold manner that conveyed authority without having to raise his voice. This made him a natural leader at work and, at home, someone Sophie could always trust to solve practical problems. Despite his controlled posture, there was something deeply vulnerable about him, something Sophie always said she loved. It was as if, behind the facade of a strong man, there was a boy who was still looking for recognition. He wasn't one for great displays of affection, but he was present in subtle ways, a cup of coffee left on Sophie's desk before she started a busy day, a simple but affectionate note hidden in her pocket, or his patience with that he listened to long descriptions of the projects she was working on. Sophie, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of emotions and energy. She had an easy laugh and a spontaneity that Thomas deeply admired, even if, at times, she took him out of his comfort zone. Raised in a more privileged environment, Sophie always had room to explore her creativity, and her career was a reflection of this. She was passionate about what she did, transforming ordinary environments into vibrant spaces, full of personality. Sophie had a unique ability to see beauty where others saw chaos, and this was reflected not only in her work but also in her personal life. She made a point of creating special moments, whether it was an unexpected dinner or a quick trip to the coast. Despite all this brilliance, there was a restlessness about Sophie, a constant feeling that something was always missing, although she could rarely put her finger on it. Together, they had a routine that, to many, might seem ideal. Mornings began with Sophie quickly getting ready for a meeting with clients or suppliers, while Thomas read the day's news over a mug of strong coffee. Evenings were reserved for dinner together, something they kept as an unspoken rule no matter how busy the day had been. They discussed work, friends, sometimes reminisced about past trips and planned new destinations. In the eyes of outsiders, there was no doubt that there was still a connection between them, even after so many years. However, as harmonious as it seemed, small cracks began to appear over time. The routine, which initially brought comfort, began to take its toll like mechanical repetition. Thomas, with his practical nature, often failed to notice the nuances in Sophie's feelings, while she, with her intensity, missed a kind of passion that he didn't know how to offer. They rarely argued, but the deep conversations that marked the first years of their marriage became increasingly scarce. Sophie missed the intensity with which he looked at her in the beginning, while Thomas didn't know how to deal with her mood swings, preferring to focus on work and day-to-day responsibilities. The company party, which took place a few weeks earlier, seemed to have been a brief escape from this monotony. Sophie, wearing an eye-catching red dress, looked radiant. She stood out in any environment, and that night was no different. Thomas, on the other hand, remained more reserved, greeting coworkers and participating in conversations about numbers and financial strategies. He knew Sophie didn't always feel comfortable at these types of events, but that night something felt different about her, an energy he couldn't fully decipher. While Thomas chatted with a group of colleagues, Sophie moved around the room, laughing and interacting with other people. The loud music and lights gave it a festive feel, but for him, it was just another social obligation. He watched from afar as she danced, first with some friends and then with someone he didn't recognize. The man seemed confident, maybe even a little invasive, and Sophie, to her surprise, didn't back down. It wasn't jealousy that bothered him, but a discomfort, a feeling that something was out of place. In the weeks following the party, this feeling of discomfort did not disappear. Thomas tried to ignore it, chalking it up to tiredness from work or his own paranoia. He knew that Sophie was a free spirit, that she liked interacting with people and that she had never given him any reason to distrust her. Still, there was something in her eyes, a distance he couldn't ignore. On the other hand, Sophie also noticed something different about him. He was more introspective, less present in conversations, as if he were trapped in a world she couldn't reach. At work, things were also more tense for Thomas. Recently, the company had been facing internal audits and investigations, something that increased pressure on him and his team. There were rumors of irregularities, but nothing concrete had been revealed. Thomas was someone who valued ethics, and the idea that something could be happening without his knowledge bothered him deeply. He threw himself into his work even more diligently, believing that, perhaps, it was just a matter of time before everything would be resolved. Meanwhile, Sophie immersed herself in new projects, trying to fill a void that she couldn't even name. His creativity was his outlet, but even that seemed to have lost some of its luster. There were times when she would look at Thomas and wonder if he noticed her changes, her attempts to bring something new to the relationship. But he seemed increasingly absorbed in his own thoughts, and she, in turn, began to hold hers. Their life, although seemingly stable, was like a boat adrift. Neither of them knew exactly what was wrong, but they both felt like something had changed. What none of them could imagine was that the course of their lives was about to be irrevocably altered, that the choices they made, or failed to make, would lead them to a point of no return. The calm before the storm can be as deceptive as it is treacherous, and for Thomas and Sophie, the silence that enveloped their marriage was about to be shattered by a series of events that would challenge everything they believed to be true. Thomas was beginning to feel the weight of what seemed to be a growing disconnect between him and Sophie. Despite the busy days at work, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had once been his refuge, seemed filled with an oppressive silence. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed more distracted and absent, even in simple moments like dinner. He noticed how she avoided eye contact in longer conversations, how vaguely she answered his questions. But Thomas, with his rational nature, tried to convince himself that this was just a reflection of the stress they were both facing. He preferred to believe that, like everything in a long marriage, that phase would pass. At the company, the atmosphere was equally tense. Internal investigations were increasingly intense, and rumors about irregularities began to sound more like truth. Thomas dedicated himself exhaustively, reviewing documents and trying to identify any signs of problems. His absolute focus on work began to drain the energy he would have devoted to resolving the situation at home. Sophie seemed to realize this, but instead of pulling him closer, she moved even further away. She sought to occupy her mind with external commitments, quick outings, and long hours in her studio. Small details, which were previously insignificant, began to stand out to Thomas: the inconsistent schedules, the phone calls that she ended abruptly when he entered the room, the excuses to avoid more serious discussions. One Saturday, while organizing the garage, Thomas found Sophie's purse in the back seat of her car. It wasn't unusual, but as he moved it to the trunk, he noticed a folded piece of paper that had fallen out. It was a note from a restaurant, a place he didn't recognize, with a date and time that coincided with a day Sophie said she was in a work meeting. He held the paper for a moment, feeling a pang in his stomach. Maybe it was just a coincidence, he thought. He didn't want to jump to hasty conclusions, but the doubt planted was a seed that would grow every day. From that moment on, Thomas began to observe more closely. He began to pay attention to the small details that he previously ignored. Sophie had a new scent, one he had never noticed before. Her clothes, normally comfortable and casual, seemed more carefully chosen on seemingly ordinary days. Even her smile, something he loved so much, seemed less genuine. It was as if she was somewhere else, emotionally distant. But still, Thomas couldn't confront her directly. He felt cowardly, but he also feared he was wrong. He feared that, by putting his suspicions into words, he would end up destroying something that could perhaps still be saved. One night, while Sophie was taking a shower, Thomas saw her cell phone forgotten on the bedside table. He hesitated for a long moment, his heart racing and his hands sweating. He knew that crossing that line could bring up something he wasn't ready to face. But curiosity, fueled by fear and insecurity, won. He unlocked his phone and started scrolling through the messages. Some were trivial, exchanges with friends or clients, but one name in particular caught her attention. It was someone he didn't know, and the messages were more frequent than he expected. He clicked on the conversation, and the words on the screen hit him like a punch to the chest. They were messages that left little room for innocent interpretation, inside jokes, compliments that seemed excessively intimate and language that went beyond cordiality. When Sophie returned to the room, she found Thomas sitting on the bed, holding her cell phone. The expression on his face was unreadable, but she knew immediately what was happening. He didn't say anything at first, just handed the phone back to her, then got up and left the room without saying a word. Sophie tried to call out to him, but her voice sounded hesitant, almost powerless. Thomas went down to the living room and looked out the window, feeling heavy in his heart. He didn't know how to process what he had just discovered. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately, demand explanations, but another part knew that once the truth was told, there would be no going back. In the following days, Thomas avoided talking about the subject, but this only increased the tension between the two. Sophie, for her part, seemed torn between guilt and discomfort, trying to act like everything was normal but failing miserably. She knew he knew, but she also feared direct confrontation. It was as if they were both dancing around a ticking time bomb, waiting to see who would have the courage to make the first move. It was then that, on a particularly quiet night, while they were having dinner together, Thomas finally broke the silence. He placed his fork on the table, looked her straight in the eye and asked, calmly but firmly, "Do you have something to tell me?" Sophie froze for a moment, her breathing getting heavier. She knew there was no escape. "It's not what you think," she began, but Thomas interrupted her. "Then tell me exactly what it is," he said, his voice still controlled but filled with pain. Sophie tried to explain, but her words sounded disjointed, fragile. She talked about how she felt neglected, how there was a void she didn't know how to fill. But nothing she said seemed to justify what he already knew. He listened in silence, absorbing every word, until she finally admitted. There was someone else. Her words seemed to echo in the room, filling the space between them with something heavy and unbearable. Thomas didn't scream, he didn't make a scene. He just got up, grabbed his coat and left, leaving Sophie alone with the deafening sound of her own silence. Thomas drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process everything. He felt anger, sadness, humiliation, but most of all, a deep emptiness. He thought about how they got to this point, about all the times he ignored the signs, how he trusted her blindly. But the pain came not just from the betrayal itself, but from the fact that the person he loved and trusted most had become the source of his greatest disappointment. He knew he needed answers, but at that moment, the questions running through his mind were impossible to ignore. Who was the other person? How did that start? And, most importantly, why? As he parked his car in a deserted spot to try to regain control of his emotions, his mind began to connect the dots. And although he still didn't know exactly what he would face, one thing was certain: the truth was just beginning to reveal itself. Thomas spent the next few days in a state of emotional torpor, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake up. The revelation of Sophie's betrayal had left a deep mark, but he knew there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. Something didn't make sense, something bigger seemed to be hidden between the lines, and he couldn't rest until he discovered the truth. The messages he had found on her cell phone, although incriminating, did not seem sufficient to explain the extent of what was happening. He needed answers, and, most of all, he needed to understand how his life, which he thought was solid, had fallen apart so quickly. Deciding not to be a passive spectator of his own story, Thomas began connecting dots. He remembered the note from the restaurant that he had found in Sophie's car, the name that constantly appeared in the messages, and even some subtle but strange interactions he had witnessed at the company party. Everything pointed to a connection between Sophie and someone who was not just a casual stranger, but someone who was somehow embedded in her world. Investigations at the company, which had been generating tension for weeks, began to intertwine with Thomas's suspicions in a disturbing way. He realized that the man Sophie was involved with was more than a lover, he was part of something that threatened everything Thomas had built. Determined to confront the situation, Thomas set up a meeting with a trusted colleague, someone who had access to the details of the internal investigations. During the conversation, he discovered that the name that appeared in Sophie's messages was also linked to suspicious transactions within the company. It was a well-planned scam, but for Thomas, what made it even more devastating was Sophie's involvement. Although he had no concrete proof of his direct participation, it was impossible to ignore the connection. The weight of emotional betrayal was now magnified by a suspicion of professional betrayal, and it consumed him from the inside out. Deciding to seek answers directly from Sophie, Thomas waited until she got home that night. The silence between them over the last few days had become almost unbearable, but he knew he couldn't put off that conversation any longer. When she entered, he was waiting for her in the living room, sitting on the sofa, with an expression that mixed pain, anger, and determination. Sophie hesitated at the sight of him, knowing that the storm that had been hanging over them was finally about to explode. He started directly, bluntly, asking about the man she was involved with. Sophie tried to dodge, but Thomas left no room for evasion. He mentioned the name, the restaurant, the messages. With each detail he revealed, her face became paler. When she finally admitted to the affair, her voice was little more than a whisper. But Thomas was not satisfied with this confession alone. He wanted to know more, he needed to know how involved she was in the scheme that was threatening the company. That's when Sophie, initially hesitant, began to reveal a truth he never could have anticipated. She said the man, named Eric, had approached her in a moment of vulnerability, offering attention and understanding that she felt was lacking in her marriage. At first it was just harmless flirting, but it quickly escalated into something more serious. Sophie explained that she had no idea, at first, who Eric really was or what he did. He was charming, persuasive, and made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. But eventually he began sharing details of his plans, revealing that he was involved in a scheme within Thomas's company. At first, Sophie said she tried to distance herself, but Eric was manipulative, using their relationship as a way to pressure her. He asked for information about Thomas, details that could help him advance the scheme. Sophie insisted that she had never provided anything significant, but at the same time, she couldn't deny that she had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. She confessed that she knew more than she should have, that she had ignored warning signs because she was blinded by the attention she was receiving. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said, tears streaming down her face, but Thomas could feel nothing but an icy, rising anger. As Sophie spoke, Thomas began to connect the dots more clearly. He realized that the coup at the company was not just an act of opportunism. Eric had planned everything with precision, and the relationship with Sophie was part of a much bigger game. It was as if everything in his life had been carefully manipulated, and he was now just a piece on a board controlled by someone he didn't even know personally. Sophie's betrayal was devastating, but the extent of Eric's manipulation was even more disturbing. When Sophie finished speaking, Thomas was silent for a long moment. He stood up, walked to the window and looked out, trying to process what he had just heard. His mind was a storm of thoughts, conflicting emotions ranging from anger to despair, from humiliation to determination. Finally, he turned to Sophie, his voice firm but filled with pain. "You don't understand what you did. It's not just about us. It's about everything we built, about everything I worked to protect. You destroyed it." Sophie tried to respond, but the words failed her. She knew that any attempt to justify or minimize what she had done would only make things worse. Thomas left the house that night, without saying where he was going, leaving Sophie alone with her guilt and regret. He knew he couldn't solve everything right then and there, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let Eric get away with it. What started as a search for personal answers was now turning into something much bigger. Thomas was determined to confront Eric, to expose the scheme, to regain control of his life. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he knew he wasn't willing to be another victim. And, as he drove through the city, his mind was already formulating the first steps of a plan that would change everything. Thomas drove for hours without a clear destination. The emptiness of the road at night seemed to echo what he felt inside, a silence filled with pain and uncertainty. But his mind was not still. Sophie's every word, every detail of what she had revealed, swirled around in her head like an incessant storm. He couldn't just accept what he had heard. She couldn't allow Eric, this stranger who had invaded her life, to continue manipulating everything around her. Thomas needed to confront him, needed to face the source of the chaos that had consumed his life. When morning arrived, Thomas had already decided on his next move. He went straight to his office, ignoring his exhaustion. "I knew the investigation into Eric was progressing, but I also knew I needed something more direct." He met with one of the audit team leaders and discreetly asked for access to any information that could help him locate Eric. His request, although unusual, was granted thanks to the trust he had built over the years. Within hours, Thomas had an address. Eric's house was in a neighborhood that was a complete contrast to Thomas's understated style. It was an ostentatious place, with luxurious cars parked in the garage and a facade that screamed wealth. As he approached, Thomas felt a mix of anger and determination. He parked at a safe distance and watched for a few minutes, trying to control the thoughts that were running rampant in his mind. When he finally decided to get out of the car, he took a deep breath and walked to the door, knocking firmly. Eric answered with a smile that immediately irritated Thomas. It was a confident, almost condescending smile, as if he knew exactly why Thomas was there. Before Thomas could say anything, Eric invited him in, as if this were a social visit. Eric's coldness was disconcerting, but Thomas didn't back down. He walked in, keeping his fists clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to explode. "I know exactly who you are and what you did," Thomas said, his voice firm but filled with restrained anger. "You not only destroyed my marriage, but you are trying to destroy my career. I want to know exactly what you think you're going to get out of all this." Eric leaned back in his chair, seemingly calm. "Do you think this is personal?" Thomas. It is not. It's just business. And if your wife chose to get involved with me, maybe that says more about what was missing in your relationship than it does about me. Eric's words cut Thomas like a blade, but he didn't relent. Business? Is business what you call using a person, manipulating someone who you knew was vulnerable? This goes beyond business, Eric. You have crossed all limits. Eric laughed, a low, insidious laugh. Did I cross the line? Perhaps. But who is really paying the price here? I'm still in control, Thomas. You, on the other hand, seem to be on the verge of collapse. Thomas took a step forward, anger burning in his eyes. You are not in control of anything. Everything you did will be exposed. I already know enough to finish you off, and you know it. For a moment, Eric's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. Maybe you have information, but that's not enough. Exposing myself means exposing your own wife. Are you prepared to deal with this? Are you willing to destroy her reputation to try to get to me? The mention of Sophie made Thomas hesitate. He knew Eric was playing with his feelings, trying to manipulate his anger into making a mistake. But Thomas also knew he couldn't allow fear to paralyze him. This isn't about Sophie. This is about you, and I'm going to make sure you pay for everything you've done. Eric stood up, approaching Thomas. You can try, but in the end, I will always be one step ahead. That's the difference between us. Thomas left before he lost control. His mind was racing, but he knew that giving in to his anger wouldn't solve anything. He needed hard evidence, something he could use to dismantle Eric once and for all. In the days that followed, Thomas worked tirelessly. He cross-referenced information, analyzed documents and talked to trusted colleagues to gather evidence. During this process, he discovered something that would completely change the course of the situation. Not only was Eric involved in a corruption scheme, but he had also diverted a significant amount of money into secret accounts, using Sophie as a key player to access confidential information. Thomas felt the weight of betrayal again, but this time, he was determined to use it as fuel to expose the whole truth. When he finally gathered everything he needed, Thomas contacted the company's legal team and the authorities. He knew the process would be long and that the consequences would be devastating for everyone involved, but he couldn't allow Eric to continue. During the interrogation, Sophie was called to testify. Thomas was there, watching as she, for the first time, fully faced the impact of her actions. She was visibly shaken, but cooperated with the investigation, providing information that helped incriminate Eric. That day, after the interrogation, Sophie tried to talk to Thomas. They were outside the building, the air thick with the distant sounds of the city. I know nothing I say will change what I did, but I want you to know that it was never my intention to hurt you like this. Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. Intention or not, you hurt. And not just me. You hurt yourself, our life, everything we built. I don't know if I can forgive that. Sophie nodded, tears filling her eyes. I know. But even so, I'm going to do everything I can to fix this. Not for us, but because I need to face what I did. Thomas didn't respond right away. He looked at the horizon, trying to find some clarity amidst the confusion he felt. I hope you can do it. Because I don't know if I can go on with this anymore. The investigation resulted in Eric's arrest and a complete turnaround of the company. Thomas was recognized for his integrity and the crucial role he played in exposing the scheme, but victory came at a cost. His relationship with Sophie was in shambles, and he knew the road ahead would be lonely. But at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he had control over his own life again. And as he let go of the past, he knew that although he was hurt, he was finally free to start over. The days following the climax of the research were enveloped in an eerie, heavy silence. For Thomas, the professional victory brought bitter relief. He had managed to unmask Eric, expose the scheme, and protect the company, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. There was a lingering feeling of emptiness, as if the triumph wasn't enough to fill the gaps left by what had been lost. The home that was once her refuge now felt like just a physical space, devoid of any sense of belonging. The walls held memories that he didn't know if he wanted to preserve or forget. Sophie was still in the house, but the dynamic between them was almost non-existent. Conversations, when they happened, were short and superficial. Thomas avoided prolonging any interactions, while Sophie seemed to desperately want to find a way to reconnect, even though she knew the emotional distance between them was now a chasm. He watched her from afar, trying to decipher her intentions, but also questioning whether he was still capable of trusting any of her words or gestures. Every time their eyes met, Thomas was overcome by a mixture of anger, pain and a melancholy that he couldn't define. One afternoon, he decided to leave the house aimlessly, just to escape the weight that seemed to crush him inside. He walked for hours, passing places that had once been important to him and Sophie. The cafe where they used to drink coffee on Sundays, the square where he had proposed marriage, everything now seemed wrapped in a cruel irony. He wondered how things could have changed so much, how the love he felt for her, so solid and unshakable, had turned into something so hard to bear. He felt torn between the desire to leave her completely behind and a nostalgia that, try as he might, he couldn't erase. While Thomas struggled internally, Sophie tried to face her own shadows. Guilt was a constant presence, but she also felt a growing desire to redeem herself, even though she knew it might be too late to save the marriage. She began looking for ways to rebuild something in her life, to prove to herself, and, perhaps, to Thomas, that it wasn't just the mistakes she had made. She offered to collaborate with authorities, providing more information about Eric and the scheme. Although it was difficult to revisit every detail, she knew it was necessary. It was a small step, but it was the only one she could take at that moment. One night, upon returning home, Thomas found Sophie in the living room, surrounded by documents. He hesitated for a moment before entering, but she looked up and called out to him. There was something in her voice, a tone of sincerity that made him stop. She started talking, explaining what she was doing, how she was helping to complete the investigation. Thomas listened, initially skeptical, but realized there was something different about her. It was not an attempt to justify what he had done, but a genuine effort to repair the damage. He didn't know if that was enough, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could listen to Sophie without his anger completely taking over him. As the days turned into weeks, the scenery around them began to change. The consequences of what happened to Eric and the scheme began to unfold. Eric was facing multiple charges, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Sophie was spared formal charges thanks to her collaboration, but the emotional impact of the proceedings was still profound. She began seeking therapy, something Thomas noticed but didn't comment on. He understood that she needed to deal with her own issues, but he still didn't know if he was ready to allow this to bring them closer together again. A moral dilemma began to take shape in Thomas's mind. On the one hand, he felt that Sophie was sincerely trying to change, trying to become a better person. On the other hand, he didn't know if he was capable of overcoming what had happened. He wondered if it was possible to rebuild something that had been so deeply damaged, if there was room for forgiveness, or if it was better to move forward alone. Doubt consumed him, and he began to realize that the answer was not simple, that there might never be a completely satisfactory solution. A turning point came when he received a call from the lawyer handling the case against Eric. The case was almost over, and the lawyer wanted to personally thank Thomas for his integrity and courage in dealing with such a difficult situation. After the call, Thomas sat in his office, looking at the evidence that had been gathered, the reports he had reviewed, the notes he himself had taken. He realized that he had managed to stand up to Eric, protect his career and, in a way, his dignity. But what he still didn't know was how to face himself and the conflicting feelings he carried. One Friday night, Sophie approached Thomas with a letter in her hand. She explained that she had written down everything she wanted to say because she thought it might be easier for him to read it than to hear it. Thomas took the letter, hesitantly, but thanked him without opening it right there. Later, sitting on his bed, he began to read. Sophie's words were honest, raw. She admitted every mistake, every choice she had made, without trying to soften or minimize the impact she had caused. She talked about her regret, about how she had lost something she never should have put at risk. But most of all, she expressed gratitude for everything they had shared, even if it could never be recovered. Thomas finished reading with a lump in his throat. He knew Sophie was being sincere, but he also knew that no matter how genuine her regret was, it didn't erase what had happened. He looked at the ceiling for a long time, reflecting on everything he had been through, on who he was before all that and who he had become. He didn't know what the next step would be, but he knew he needed time. And for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward, whatever path he chose. Thomas was sitting in the cafe where it all started, the same place where he and Sophie had first met years ago. The choice was not accidental. He needed a space to reflect, to put in order the fragments of his life that seemed to be floating aimlessly since the storm that the betrayal and the scheme had unleashed. That place, with its walls full of memories, seemed like the ideal place to face the past and decide the future. Sophie had left the house the week before, a move she said was to give Thomas space. She didn't want to force anything, she knew that the control of their destiny was now in his hands. She had moved to a small temporary apartment, where she spent her days reorganizing her life and facing the consequences of her choices. Sophie had decided to leave her job in interior design and dedicate herself to volunteering at a local organization that helped women deal with emotional and family dilemmas. It was her way of dealing with guilt, an effort to turn her pain into something constructive, even though she knew it would never erase what she had done. Meanwhile, Thomas was also trying to rebuild his own life. He didn't return to the house after Sophie left. There was something about the place that felt too charged, a space he could no longer call home. He rented a small apartment close to work, a modest place but one that gave him the feeling of a new beginning. He spent his days focused on the company, helping to consolidate the changes that came after Eric's fall. However, he knew that work alone would not fill the void that still existed within him. Eric, in turn, faced the full weight of the law. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the court had no difficulty in convicting him. His financial maneuvers had harmed countless people inside and outside the company, and he showed no remorse during the trial. For him, everything had always been about power and control, and now he was faced with the consequences of his arrogance. Eric was sentenced to a long prison term, and as he walked out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his expression of indifference finally gave way to something closer to defeat. Despite the legal victory, Thomas felt no satisfaction. Seeing Eric punished didn't erase the emotional scars, it didn't resolve the chaos he had left in his personal life. But somehow it was an end to a part of the story. It was a reminder that some battles were won in quiet ways, not with celebrations, but with the acceptance that justice does not always bring immediate peace. Sophie reached out to Thomas one last time before he made his final decision. They met in the park they used to frequent when things were still simple, when the problems they faced seemed small and distant. Sophie was different. There was a serenity in her face, a weight that seemed lifted, not because she had forgotten what she had done, but because she had finally learned to carry the burden of guilt without allowing it to consume her. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted to say thank you. Be grateful for everything you shared, even if that was now part of the past. She wanted Thomas to find happiness, even if it meant going in opposite directions. Thomas listened in silence, absorbing every word. He knew there was something honest in what she said, something that before might have been suffocated by the chaos of emotions. But he also knew that the love he felt for Sophie, however deep it was, had been irreversibly altered. He responded that he forgave her, not because he wanted to rebuild what they had lost, but because he knew that forgiveness was the only way for both of them to move forward. The farewell was peaceful, without tears or big dramatic gestures. It was just a moment of acceptance, a closure to a chapter that needed to end. Time passed, and life began to follow new paths. Thomas met someone by chance, a colleague who had just been hired at the company. It was unlike anything he had experienced before, a connection built slowly, without rush or unrealistic expectations. She was kind, understanding, and, most of all, she seemed to bring a lightness to his life that he didn't even know he needed. He didn't know where it would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. Sophie, in turn, found new strength in her volunteer work. She devoted her energies to helping others overcome dilemmas that she herself knew well. Her pain became an instrument of empathy, and it gave her a purpose she had never felt before. It wasn't a complete redemption, but it was a step towards something better, something more authentic. Thomas and Sophie's lives followed different paths, but each found a way to make peace with the past. What happened between them would never be erased, but it no longer needed to define them. What began as a story of betrayal and pain became a journey of growth, acceptance and, in some ways, liberation. And so, the story comes to an end. Leave in the comments what you thought of this journey of emotions, difficult choices and new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, where we explore the consequences of actions that can change lives forever. Remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal, and all the stories told here are fictional, with the intention of showing the impact that wrong choices can have. Thanks for following along this far, and see you in the next story.